I'm David Ackerley, Dean of Rouser College, and absolutely thrilled to welcome you all here. My remarks will be very brief, and I will turn this over to the stars of the evening. The first one is, of course, please silence your cell phones. There, you got the most important remark of the evening. What a great audience. There's so many, there's students, faculty, alumni, friends, and it's absolutely wonderful. Before I do turn it over, I really actually just want to tell two short anecdotes about our wonderful speakers. No, really short. So first of all, 2018, Jerry and I went to a football game together. At the time, he had the germ of an idea for a book. And I can tell you, it's a great book. And 5 years later, I don't know if I can claim to have accomplished as much as producing a great book. So absolutely wonderful. No, it's been one of the pleasures of my summer reading this book in anticipation of seeing you in this. Alison, I had the pleasure of being on her Ph.D. committee, and I'll just pick out one. She just wrote this incredibly wonderful paper about vegetation change on Point Reyes after the Vision Fire. And it influenced my thinking at that moment to think about fire. And so thank you. That was a great moment. And of course, wonderful thesis and wonderful work since then. And you'll learn more about that. So my role first is to introduce Lou Feldman, director of our lovely, wonderful Botanic Garden, and our host tonight. Lou is formerly a faculty member in the college, 40 years in plant and microbial biology. We first started interacting and teaching Bio 1B years ago. He was an associate dean for the college for many, many years, and then several years ago stepped up into a role leading this absolutely wonderful place. So Lou, thank you.
I hope that's for David and not for me. So, yeah. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to the Botanical Garden. It's a really special place, and I hope you have an opportunity, if you're not doing it today, if you're here, to look around. The garden is started in 1890 on the main campus. It consists of 34 acres, and what distinguishes this garden probably from any other garden in the world is that most of the plants in the garden are wild collected, which means that they have the original genetic background of the plants growing in the wild. And they are, in some cases, already extinct in their natural environments. They have a large database for each of the plants. So I encourage you to take a look at the plants. If you have any research interests, we're very happy to accommodate you. Today, what I wanted to do is just to briefly review the connections which have existed for quite some time between the Botanical Garden and the National Park Service. And I'd like to begin with a slide of our Redwood Grove, which is across the street. I hope many of you, if you haven't seen it, and if you're staying at Berkeley, will have the opportunity to visit this grove. The grove was planted. It's about 5 acres. It has about almost 500 redwood trees in it. And it was in honor of the first director of the National Park Service, Stephen Mather. The grove is named, and there's an amphitheater in the grove. I'll show you a picture of it in a moment. It is a wonderful way of remembering Mather and also a way of tying the Park Service to the garden. The Park Service plaque, which was installed to honor Mather, is the Mather Redwood Grove. Here you can see your first Horace Albright and Bob Ornda, who was the former chair of botany, reviewing a plate which is installed in the garden entrance for the Redwood Grove, and is actually honoring Mather and dedicating the Redwood Grove to him. So this happened in 1970, and that grove is now almost 90 years old. It also has an amphitheater in it. If you have a chance to look at it, this amphitheater was built also shortly after the Mather plaque was actually dedicated. Finally, I wanted to show you a picture of this amphitheater. When you go to the amphitheater, it is surrounded by redwood trees, and the redwood trees create a magical atmosphere, a magical environment. We have many activities there, and when people come to the grove, it is very easy for them to think of Mather and of the fact that he had such a profound effect on the National Park Service. Finally, I just want to indicate to you that we are actually now continuing our work with the Park Service. These are plants which are being rescued or which are being restored in the various areas of Point Reyes and in the national parks that are in the Point Reyes area. And this is a plant which is being repopulated in the Point Reyes area, and it is being done in cooperation with the Park Service. And then I also want to point out to you, these are some of the other issues that we're working on with the Park Service. Most particularly, I want to point out that this garden has an emphasis on seed banking, especially seed banking rare and endangered California species. And with the Park Service, we are doing this seed banking, and the seeds are either germinated here for new plants or are kept in a freezer and then are scattered in areas of Point Reyes or wherever we want to restore the native flora to. So I think with that, I will stop and just say that the Park Service and the garden are going to continue to have an interaction together. That interaction will probably revolve around the seed bank. And for those of you who've been to the Presidio, I realize the Presidio is not technically a national park, but we are actually working on restoring some of the native flora to that particular area. So thank you for coming tonight, and I want you to leave with the message that the garden and the Park Service are connected, and we will continue to be connected, hopefully for many years.
Thank you, Lou. Many people here know how deep the history of Berkeley and the Park Service go, and I won't even start to tell that story because this will unfold tonight. And the Botanic Garden is just one wonderful piece of that puzzle. So I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Patrick Gonzalez, who will moderate the evening's event. Patrick is the executive director of our Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity. He's a climate change scientist, a forest ecologist, a proud alum, a Ph.D. from the Energy and Resources Group here at Berkeley. He, among other distinctions, served as the principal climate change scientist of the U.S. National Park Service for several years, including surviving the darker years of the Trump administration in that role, an assistant director for climate and biodiversity for 1 year in the Biden White House a year ago. And he has also served as a lead author on multiple reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the science panel that won a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. So welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, is this on? Okay. Welcome to everybody, and thanks for your interest in hearing about science in the U.S. National Parks today. Thanks to David for the introduction, and thanks to Lou for this scenic location, and thanks to Estella Leopold, whose generosity funds this lecture series in honor of A. Starker Leopold. And in doing so, she continues the legacy of their father, Aldo Leopold, who inspired generations of conservationists around the world to help protect nature and our Earth. So I have the great honor of introducing our first speaker today, Jerry Emory. Jerry is a conservation writer, and he is the author of this new book, George Melendez-Wright, The Fight for Wildlife and Wilderness in Our National Parks. So his writing really shows meticulous historical research and nice storytelling. I really appreciated this book, and he brings to life the life of a scientist from a century ago, and I really appreciated this book. So thank you, Jerry. Jerry has published 5 other books, articles in National Geographic and other magazines. He's previously worked for the California State Parks Foundation, the Save the Redwoods League, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, always in conservation. And today, we're very proud to have Jerry Emory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Working well. And I just need that clicker, and we're good to go. It's really an honor to be here. It's a beautiful day, incredible afternoon. And it's nice to be back on campus anytime. And I wanted to thank Dean Hackerly and Patrick for putting this together, and also John Jarvis here sitting right in the front so he can kick me. You probably all know John. I won't I shouldn't have to tell you who he is, but he was instrumental in getting this book published. He literally introduced me to his editor at the Chicago Press, and I had already written the manuscript and sent it along, and here we are. So 40 years ago, on campus, I met a young woman. We fell in love, and we got married. It was a lot more complicated than that. And she's right here tonight, Jeannie Lloyd. And you don't even know, you shouldn't be clapping yet. She's one of George Wright's granddaughters. And so that's how I got to know George Wright. Not only through Jeannie, but then also through her mother, Pamela Melendez Wright Lloyd, who's still with us at 90 and can still talk me underneath the table, but with good talk. Also, I gave a talk today to the Hispanic Resources Group of the National Park Service. So if I'm a little hoarse, that's why, but I got my waters back here and I'm good to go. So let's talk about George a little bit. He was a local boy born in San Francisco in 1904. And this is his father, John T. Wright, who came from a long line of steamship captains in San Francisco during the gold rush and the forward. And he had a import-export business that he carried on up and down the Pacific coast. One of those places where he had an agent was in El Salvador. He imported a lot of raw goods from there, exported finished goods. And he met Mercedes Melendez, and they got married in 1892 in San Salvador. They moved to San Francisco and created a family, had 3 boys. They had John, or Juan, the oldest boy, George, the middle boy, and the youngest kid was Carlos. Fortunately, by the time this picture was taken, about 1913 on Mount Tamalpais with an unknown Salvadoran relative, both of his parents were gone. So at the age of 8 or 9, he was actually raised by his great aunt. And I also have to excuse, because my notes are over here on this laptop, so occasionally I'm going to walk over if I need to see something here. So their house on Laguna Street was filled with a lot of Melendez relatives, a lot of coming and going. Both the brothers ended up going back to El Salvador to be raised, but he stayed with his great aunt in San Francisco, Auntie, and she raised him. His passion was the outdoors. He was a very good student, but he always wanted to be outdoors. He was a crazy bird watcher, and that was kind of his entree into much bigger things. And so while he was in high school, first of all, he was in the Boy Scouts. He joined the Sierra Club early on. In high school, he was a journalist, class president, and he created an Audubon Club at Lowell High School in San Francisco. So he was always oriented to things outside, as I just said. At the age of 16, this is a really nerdy photo, but I threw it in because we're in Berkeley. At 16, he came to Berkeley to start school. And he declared forestry as his major, which I found, with due respect to foresters, when I first found out about it, I was like, well, how'd that happen? He was a bird watcher and naturalist, but it makes a lot of sense when you know the history of forestry in the United States. And because he and his aunt were so close, they actually moved from San Francisco together to North Berkeley, up on Thousand Oaks. The house is still there. It's quite nice. So he began to study underneath Walter Mulford, and this is a very formal painting of Mulford in his later years. But he became one of his primary mentors here at Berkeley. Another primary mentor was Joseph Grinnell. Remember, he didn't have a father. He just had Auntie, who at the time that his parents died, his aunt was already like 72. So she was a lot older. But she took great care of him. And so Joseph Grinnell, who is very Victorian looking, he was pretty intense, apparently, from everything I've read, and I've read just about everything. But a great teacher, and he became very important to Wright, especially later in Wright's career. Another person that was very important to Wright was Joseph Scattergood Dixon, this guy right here. And the guy on the right is Harold Bryant. Both of them, at this point, they're in the Park Service, but probably at the Yosemite Field School. But Joseph Dixon worked at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, and he was an economic mammologist, incredible field person, one of the leading field zoologists in the United States next to Grinnell. He was famous for his collecting prowess, because that's what they did. They went around and shot animals and stuffed them and then brought them back to the museum. So he had three people that were really quite important to him. To begin with. Now the records, his academic records, have been lost with time, but I was able to piece together what Wright did every summer when he was here in Berkeley. And they really guide you towards thinking about his career in the future and how his summer activities shaped his career. So the first year, maybe taking a note from Grinnell and Dixon, who had spent a lot of time in Alaska, he went to Alaska in 1921. So quite young, probably with a Salvadoran cousin. He brought along a little box camera. He took this picture. This is the Mendenhall Glacier north of Juneau. The next summer, he went on a Sierra Club high trip. This is 1922, up into Kings Canyon, which he absolutely loved, and had been up there already a few times with the Sierra Club. You can tell he knew what he was doing. In 1924, actually, I looked at this picture the other day. I'm like, oh, look, George is coming back from Burning Man. But of course, he wasn't. This is 1924. And this is George and a DU friend from the fraternity. John's a proud DU, right? No? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Anyway, Wright had a Model T Ford. He loaded up with two of his buddies and drove around the West for about 2 months in a big circle, just going to national parks. They stopped in some towns occasionally, but the purpose was to go to national parks. And it was Wright's idea. Remember, 1924, so he's 20 years old. And there were no paved roads back then. I mean, it was not easy. There were some paved roads in and out of towns, but mostly it was dirt. So on this trip, they had 72 flat tires. But from the journal he kept on this trip, I learned that the previous year, in 1923, he had done the same thing, but with Robert Sibley, Bob Sibley, who was the longtime alumni director here at Berkeley, started the East Bay Regional Park District, or helped start it, and of course we have Sibley Park. He was older than Wright, but they also did the same thing, and they went to a couple different parks that these guys didn't go to. But Wright was a forestry student, and this is a picture from 1925. It's from a collection you guys might be interested in. You probably already know it. It's called the Fritz Metcalf Photo Collection in the Bioscience, Natural Resources, and Public Health Library. There are a couple of professors that took a lot of photos of students out and about. That's Wright down there on the right, taking notes, of course. And this is out in Inverness in 1925. And they also went to the Monterey Peninsula and a couple other places in the East Bay Hills. And this photo is in May of 1926. This is the graduating class of the forestry. And I don't know what happened to Wright. It's like he didn't get the memo, right? So he's the short guy in the front right. And look at his pants. It's like him and the guy on the right were out in the field. And then they remember, oh my God, the class photo. And this is in front of Hillgard Hall. Mulford is not in this picture. He's in most of them, actually, but not this one. Most graduating classes. And so this is May 1926 when he should have been graduating, but I think Mulford and Grinnell actually worked together pretty closely with their students. In fact, at one point, they wanted to create a joint master's degree between forestry and the MVZ. And I learned all this from the incredible archives at the MVZ, the letters. And, but they probably had an agreement, and what happened to Wright that summer was he joined Dixon and went up to Mount McKinley for 2 months on a collecting expedition. And you can see this very nice photo from Dixon. He was one of the lead people using photography in field work at the time, and he taught that to Wright. And they went up there. It also shows, this is page 1 of Wright's journal, up from McKinley, which of course is Denali today. showing that he was using the Grinnellian note-taking system, which I won't explain right now, but look it up because it's amazing and people still use it. They went up there ostensibly to collect as many things as they could, and they did. They stayed in an old cabin that had nothing in it. It was just a big open square. They went out for 15, 20-mile hikes, on a daily basis with their knapsacks, and they're collecting guns. But the expedition was actually funded by a wealthy East Coast collector named John Thayer, and he wanted the eggs and the nest of a surfbird because they had never been found by European Americans, right? And so that's an indication of where you can really identify where a species is. If you find a nest, you know that it's from there, and it was a big deal at the time. Long story short, George Wright found the nest when Dixon was back at camp with a hurt ankle, and it was big news in ornithological circles. Incredible photo, right? Look at this photo, it's beautiful. Of course, after the photo, they shot the bird, they collected the eggs, and they scooped up the nest, and they're now in the Harvard Zoological Museum, or that's not the proper term, but they're back in Harvard because John Thayer was from the East Coast. When he died, he donated everything there. And I actually tracked him down just to verify that because I was really nerding out for a while. By the end of 1927, Wright had joined the National Park Service and moved to Yosemite. And here he is with a huge box camera. Can you imagine carrying that thing around? And he was already beginning to think about what he became famous for. One of the things he became famous for, which is the wildlife survey. And he was still thinking about it. There's Wright in the right front with his tie on. This is probably the field school, but he also just did a lot of natural history walks year round. So he was learning how a park functioned from the inside as opposed to always just visiting from the outside. And during this period, his boss was a guy named Carl Russell, and the two of them began thinking about wildlife survey, and he also was talking with Joseph Dixon a lot about it. And the reason why is because Wright had been to all the parks. He knew the parks better than almost anyone else he was working with, and he knew there was a whole series of problems in the parks, especially around wildlife, that he wanted to scientifically study and then get back to the director and the people back in Washington with management suggestions. So you remember that, so at this point he's all of, 24 years old, right? And so he and Dixon actually were the real thought partners in this, but Carl Russell also helped out. And of course, wherever George went, Auntie went. So when he moved to Yosemite, so did Auntie. She moved into the Ahwahnee and lived there for a year. It had just been finished in August of 1927. Wright moved up there in November of 1927, and she came along, and I was able to, this came from a slide that looked like a glass slide that had like nothing on it. And I brought it to a specialist. She's like, oh yeah, I can do this. And then I verified the stuff in the back that it's the Ahwahnee. So she lived there for about a year. That's George Wright's hands down there in the right corner. She passed in December of 1928. And that's really when George started working a lot about this wildlife survey and trying to figure out the logistics and how he was going to convince. At that point, still Mather was the director. It wasn't until 29 that Albright came along. And in the summer of 1929, he had a very interesting meeting with Totuya, or Maria Librado. And the reason why they called in Wright was because he spoke Spanish. He was raised in a bilingual household. And even though his mom had died when he was quite early, he had aunts and uncles and other people that were in the house, and he kept it up. So think about this. This is the reason why this is really interesting. Well, many different reasons. Great photo, Dixon again. She was with her family and the rest of the Amanichi people run out of Yosemite Valley in 1851 by the Mariposa Battalion. And she had not been back since then. And so she only spoke Spanish, and so they called in Wright, and they spent the day together. This is at the museum at Yosemite, and you can tell, I mean, that's an intense conversation going on. And I think it also impacted Wright excuse me for a second, impacted Wright in the way he looked at so-called pristine landscapes. Back then, that's the term they used for wilderness. They kind of interchange it with wilderness a little bit. But the whole concept of what was pristine, I think this meeting and meeting someone that had lived in the valley in 1851 really changed his outlook on things, because he became very involved in wilderness issues, excuse me, later on in his life, which is only a couple years down the road. So at this point, he was very seriously thinking about the Wildlife Survey. He had run it past. At this point, Albright was the director. Mather had to retire for health reasons. And Albright agreed a month before the stock market crash. And the reason why that's important is because Wright paid for the first 2 years of the Wildlife Survey, and he deposited $10,000 in a trust in San Francisco. One of the trustees was Mulford. Another one was someone from the Park Service, and then his family lawyer. And that was to pay for all salaries, equipment, incidentals. And Albright agreed and sent out a note to the staff across the West and said, this is what these guys are doing. Give them all the help that you can. So this is the intrepid team right here. Right on the left in the middle is Ben Thompson, who was his dear friend and fought partner. And then Joseph Dixon on the right, you can tell he's a little stern, that guy. But he was really good in the field. I actually was able to interview Ben Thompson in 1987. He had a long service with the Park Service, long career. And then I was also able to interview a couple of the children of Joseph Dixon in 2000. And they remembered Wright coming over to their house. They liked him. Wright also bought a new Buick and had it customized, had the back taken off and had waterproof compartments built in the back for all their equipment. And this photo I think is pretty funny because they're in their official, MPS uniform, which they never wore. They never wore those things. But I think George Wright took this photo and said, we got to send this back to the boss, for PR purposes. He was always very good about communication and PR. But most of the time it looked like this. And so for the next 3 years, they started traveling around the West in the field season, which was spring through fall, doing those big circuits, just like Wright had done when he was much younger. And they always stopped and would talk to the superintendents, the head rangers. They talked to local people in the community, asking them a whole series of questions. When did livestock show up in this area? When's the last time you saw a wolf? When's the last time you saw a grizzly bear? When's the last time you saw a mountain lion? And they recorded all this information and also were observing how the individual parks were being managed or not managed in some cases. And they weren't getting mad at any people that were shooting coyotes or other things. They were just observing and recording because that was their charge. Wright spent a total of almost 7 months in Yosemite over a 3-year period, mostly studying this species right here, which he's the trumpeter swan. They were down to like 20. So we helped save the trumpeter swan eventually. Long story. Got to read the book. They also worked a lot on bear issues. These are grizzly bears at one of the 3 feeding stations in Yosemite at the time. And I was just up in Yellowstone, sorry. I was just in Yosemite a couple weeks ago, and I was telling the group about bears and how much they worked on bears and how it was such a conundrum and they can never figure it out. They tried all these different things in Yellowstone and Yosemite. And in the front row, there was a couple people from Yosemite's bear team, a couple of young guys, and they were like, oh, yeah, because it's still an issue. They're also very much interested in pronghorn. At the time, they were a big conservation species. They were seen as the ecological cohort of bison, and their numbers were probably as large as theirs at some point. So they're always looking for proper range for introducing pronghorn or recording pronghorn when they saw them. All 3 of these guys were also very good botanists. And so they were very much interested in plant species out there. This is a very unfortunate photo, actually taken by Dixon earlier in Sequoia National Park. But the killing of predators in national parks and Forest Service land and other public lands was just rampant. It was done by the Biological Survey, ironically. But they had a branch that did predator control. And so I got to go over here and read you some of these numbers because they're startling. Between 1916 and 1928, they killed over 8,400 wolves, 325,000 coyotes, 1,900 mountain lions, 36,000 bobcats and lynx, 1,300 bears, and countless numbers of ground squirrels and other rodents, that they thought were harmful. And those numbers are low. I actually went back and read all their annual reports. So that's where I got those numbers, the Biological Survey. And they underreported them because they only counted them if they found a carcass. And of course, a lot of animals hightail it after they're poisoned or hurt. And this, Grinnell and Mulford and Wright fought against predator control tooth and nail, and eventually had some wins. Also, overgrazing was a huge issue in parks and around parks. There's a really funny entry in one of Wright's journals where he's been hiking and hiking and hiking in the Grand Canyon and comes around the corner and there's a cow. And he was just like, this is wrong, basically. He said it a little more eloquently than that, but he said, this is wrong. And at another time, Dixon was in Mesa Verde National Park and counted 5,000 sheep. So it was an issue. And also the livestock industry, of course, was quite entrenched. I'm just showing this picture real quickly because during research for this, I, with the help of someone at Harper's Ferry, discovered the entire collection of the Wildlife Survey's photos. There's 14,000 of them. And they're an incredible resource for researchers today. And during the pandemic, we were lucky enough to find a donor who was interested in fulfilling the archivist's dream, which was to scan every single one professionally and then add the metadata and put them online. So not every single one's online yet, but the vast majority of them. And they're just amazing to look through. Because you can, the metadata, you can search, bear, Yellowstone, trumpeter swan, you name it. Part of the deal for doing the survey for 3 years, and I neglected to mention that their office was in Hillgard Hall, because the MPS and Berkeley had a long connection. The education department was based out of Hillgard Hall from 1925 on for a while, and the wildlife survey was there until about 1934. So they would come back to Berkeley every winter and write up their notes, type up their notes. They had someone type up their notes, do research, write letters, plan their next season, and begin to write these two. Amazing volumes, Fauna 1 and Fauna 2. This was completed in 1932, published in 33, the other one 34 and 35. So I have to get up here because there's a couple things. In Fauna number 1, which historian Richard West Sellers called just an amazing document and radical change from previous management practices. And on the back, one of the last 2 pages are 20 suggestions for management in the National Park Service. Some of the ones that he hit on all the time were problems with borders. He hated the fact that the borders were artificial in national parks. Everything should be researched before any kind of management decisions are made. Artificial feeding should stop. Stop all predator control. Restoration of native species in the landscapes, which was like a new science. It wasn't even a science then, it was just a new idea. And let me see, stop sending animals between parks and have a complete faunal investigation of every single park. That's just partial. Now, he wasn't always bird watching. Oh, I just kind of made a joke because this is his fiance. He proposed to B. Ray, who was also a Berkeley graduate, in 1930. They got married in 1931. And she went on a lot of the survey work with them initially until this happened. And that's my mother-in-law there on the left, and George Wright. And during this period, when they finished up the survey and they finished up those publications, Wright eventually moved to DC because they created a wildlife division and he was put in charge of it. And so the family moved to Washington, DC. And from there, he started doing special assignments for the director. This is Puerto Rico, where they went down, and that's Harold Bryant on the right, where they went down to look at parks. He was very involved in the Everglades, going up in a blimp here. This is Roger Toll, this big man right here, and there's Wright. And then Harold Bryant on the far right, and this is a Park Service engineer. And these two were really quite good friends, very tight. Roger Toll was the superintendent of Yellowstone, and during the winter, they would just close the park because no one would go there, and they would assign Toll to go out and do these special projects, oftentimes with Wright. In 1935, Wright was tagged to head up the Park Service's effort to create Kings Canyon National Park, because he knew it like the back of his hand, and he knew Ansel Adams. In fact, this photo is by Ansel Adams. It's called, I have to say this because they allow me to use it, it's called a proof print. And I found this in the Bancroft Library, and inside this amazing Ansel Adams volume from 1935, excuse me. And this is the former head of the Sierra Club here and the present head of the Sierra Club, and they really are talking strategy about how to create that park. It didn't happen that year or the next year. It took a little while, but Wright and Ansel Adams were working closely on that. He had invited Adams back to a meeting in DC I'm sorry, that was the photo was in 1935. In early 1936 at a big conference, and it was the first time that Ansel Adams spoke on a big national stage. And one thing he did was he brought back prints like this. This is a fine print. It's just a snapshot of it though. And he put 8.5 by 11, and they were leave-behinds for the politicians to convince them what Kings Canyon looked like. In late 1936, he was appointed to an international commission to study the possibility of an international peace park where we have Big Bend today. So this is the contingent. Went up in a plane, crossed the Rio Grande several times. Now these are great photos because the official photographer for the Park Service was on the trip, a guy named George Grant. This is in Mexico. There's Wright down on the ground. Called Picacho Vaca, which is south of the Sierra del Carmen Biosphere Reserve today. And they had a fantastic week down there. This is the last known photo of George Wright taken by Roger Toll. 2 days later, unfortunately, both of them died in a car accident. And the Park Service lost two of their best conservationists and the leadership of both of them actually, but especially George Wright. But his legacy continues. This is a panel that I helped the people down at Big Bend put up this year. There's Mount Wright in the back, the small one, the short one. And the former superintendent who just retired, Bob Krumenaker, and I worked on this. And I think what's interesting is that after Wright passed away, because he had such a dynamic personality, which I haven't really talked about, that kept the wildlife division together. And by the time he died, he had 27 biologists that he was able to hire. I didn't even mention the Depression and the CCC and emergency funds under Roosevelt. So he was able to hire all these people. But those funds eventually dried up. Thompson and Dixon knew they didn't have the personality to keep those people together. The Fish and Wildlife Service was created out of the Biological Survey and the Fisheries Department in the early 40s, and that drew a lot of biologists away. The war happened. After the war, the Park Service concentrated on infrastructure, not research and science. But then along came Starker Leopold in this report in the early 1960s, 1963. So I see a through line from Wright to Leopold and other people that began to step up. After that, there was a Robbins report, which is really interesting to read, which just slammed the National Park Service, actually. And then later on, a report I just call the Kane Report, which was about predators. And the George Wright Society was formed in 1980 by some biologists in the Park Service, right around when John started getting active in the Park Service as a biologist. And by the way, John wrote the foreword to my book, but that's not why I'm standing so close to him.
Can't hear.
Yeah. And the George Wright Society teamed up with the Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity to create their journal, the Park Stewardship Forum. And so, full circle, and I've run over. Anyway, that's it. I'm gonna take my drinks and go home. Only kidding.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
And we're going to have questions. Later. Thank you, Jerry. George Wright was 32 when he died. And in 9 years, he introduced scientific ecosystem management to the U.S. National Park Service, and a legacy that continues today. And he left behind 2 children and his wife. I have the honor to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Alison Forrestel. Alison is a vegetation ecologist and serves as Chief of Science and Natural Resource Management for Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and where she leads a large staff of ecologists and handles all of the science and natural resource management programs. She's also the lead for the Golden... Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. She's also... Is this good? She's also the lead of the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve, which is a United Nations designated conservation area that covers all of the San Francisco Bay Area. And she has served the public for 20 years in the U.S. National Park Service. She earned her Ph.D. here at UC Berkeley, and Professor Scott Stevens was her dissertation chair. She conducted research on fire ecology in Point Reyes National Seashore and Crater Lake National Park. And in my many years of working with Alison, I've been very impressed with her progressive spirit, and particularly in integrating climate change science into management of her national park. And that is one of the innovations that she's going to share with us today. Alison.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Patrick. David, when you were sharing your anecdotes, I was a little nervous you were going to reference my qualifying exams when you stumped me with a question about quantum physics and ecology. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight as a scientist, as a national park manager, and as a UC Berkeley grad. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And I have a little personal connection to tonight's event that I'll share at the end of my time with you here today. But jumping in, I wanted to first talk about, why do we care about this topic? Why do we care about the National Park Service? Why do we care about science-based management in the Park Service? And I'm admittedly biased here, but I would argue that parks have a really unique role in our society in terms of the places and the species that they protect, in terms of the access they provide for people to connect with nature, and in terms of the role that they play as a beacon to protected places in other parts of the world, and also here at home in the US in terms of how to do conservation right. There's a quote from Wallace Stegner about the national parks that I really love. National parks are the best idea we ever had. Absolutely American, absolutely democratic. They reflect us at our best rather than our worst. There's another quote I came across as I was preparing for tonight along similar lines, and I wanted to share it because it's from a report that was co-authored by George Wright. And that quote is, "Our national heritage is richer than just scenic features. The realization is coming that perhaps our greatest national heritage is nature itself, with all its complexity and its abundance of life, which, when combined with great scenic beauty, as it is in the national parks, becomes of unlimited value." So I wanted to just start us there, kind of grounded in that importance of the Park Service. And then I'll pick up the through line of where Jerry left off in terms of George Wright all the way up to today and connecting UC Berkeley to the National Park Service. So this is a really perfect place to be talking about this topic because UC Berkeley and the Park Service and science-based management have been hand in glove from the very get-go. Hopefully no one's trying to read the words on this screen, but what this is a screenshot of a journal article in the journal Science. It was published in 1916, which was the year that the Park Service was established. And the article is, let's see, I can't read it here. I'm gonna have to do what Jerry did. The article is titled Animal Life as an Asset of the National Parks, and it's written by two UC Berkeley professors, Joseph Grinnell and Tracy Storer. And it's all about recommendations to the Park Service about how to do science-based management right as the Park Service was getting started. And I wanted to also share a quote from this article, and the quote is, "Without a scientific investigation of park wildlife, no thorough understanding of the conditions or of the practical problems they involve is possible." So right from the beginning, Berkeley was at the table telling the Park Service how to do this. As Jerry alluded to, after George Wright's untimely death, there was kind of a dark period for science in the Park Service. And to me, this picture of bear feeding is emblematic of that. During those decades of the 40s and 50s up until the early 1960s, the professional biology staff of the Park Service shrank to the single digits. I wanted to share a quote from an internal report during that time, which is, "The research effort for national parks was so poor that parks were actually endangered by ignorance." So fast forward to 1963, and at that time, the National Academy commissioned a UC Berkeley professor, the namesake of our event tonight, A. Starker Leopold, to write a report on wildlife management in the National Park Service. The report, Wildlife Management in the National Parks, which is commonly referred to as the Leopold Report, was really a watershed moment in conservation in the Park Service. And it's still very much with us today in the conservation work we're doing in the Park Service. Again, he took a much broader view than just wildlife management and made recommendations about science-based management writ large in the Park Service, talking about managing for natural processes, removing invasive species from parks, bringing science-trained professionals back into parks, so biologists and ecologists, bringing prescribed fire back into parks to restore those natural processes. And then in 2016, then director John Jarvis, who's here with us tonight, commissioned a revisiting of the Leopold Report. So that was the 100th anniversary of the Park Service. And it was an opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, we're 100 years in, we have this in guidance from 1963, but how do we update it to today? And the really core, there's a lot in that report and some really amazing recommendations around science-based management, but the core place I would describe where it departed from the original Leopold Report is around climate change. A lot of what the Leopold Report talked about was doing restoration and bringing parks back to a pre-European contact state. So, targeting restoration at what the parks might have looked like in 1800s. And what Revisiting Leopold recognized is that's no longer possible. We're in a different climate. Humans have changed so much that we can't go back to what things used to be. And so the quote from this report that really encaptures that is, "A guidance to manage in the context of continual change with a goal of preserving ecological integrity." And as a park manager, let me tell you, that is a hard thing to do. And that's kind of what I'll be talking about for the rest of my time here with you this evening. I'm going to talk about some of the work we're doing in my home park, the Golden Gate National Parks, and then talk briefly about some work happening in the Sierra Nevada, in Sequoia, and Kings Canyon National Parks. So first, just to introduce the Golden Gate National Parks, hopefully these are places familiar to all of you as your backyard national parks. 80,000 acres spanning 3 counties, Marin, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties. We're a coastal park, 91 miles of shoreline. The park was established in 1972, so we just celebrated our 50th birthday. And it was really established as the first urban national park. So a place like Yellowstone or Yosemite, where you have to drive, presumably most visitors were driving many hours to get there and experience a park. This was a different approach of bringing the park to the people. It's one of the most visited park units in the national park system, typically number 1 or number 2 each year, with somewhere between 15 and 17 million visitors a year. It's also a place of incredible biodiversity. It's part of one of 25 global biodiversity hotspots. As Patrick mentioned, it's part of the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve, which is a UNESCO designation because of the biodiversity of this place. And it just has such a diversity of ecosystems, intertidal habitats, coastal prairie, estuarine system, redwood forests, freshwater wetlands, and many, many other ecosystems. It has incredible species diversity and protects many threatened and endangered species. The Golden Gate National Parks actually protects more threatened and endangered species than any other park unit in the continental United States. There are 38 of them in the park. These are just a handful of them. And as I was thinking about, the science-based management in my work, I realized that literally everything we do is based on science. Whether it's bringing in endangered species population back and figuring out what the constraints are on preventing that species from thriving, like black abalone, as you can see here, or Mission blue butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly species here. Whether it's understanding what species are present using eDNA and inventory in our streams, as you can see here. Or hydrological engineering to plan creek restoration projects to make sure that a restored site can withstand high winter flows. This is a picture I'm really excited about. This is restoration we have going on right now in Muir Woods National Monument for salmonid habitat in the creek. So we've actually taken the water out of the creek. We've got excavators recontouring the creek so that it has the meander and the habitat structure to support coho salmon. If you can get out to Muir Woods in the next month, I highly recommend it. It's, in my opinion, really inspiring to be able to see this kind of restoration in action. But what I mostly wanted to focus on tonight is some of the work that we're doing around climate change and managing in the context of climate change. So we have just started, we're about a year into a partnership with a few different partners, Pepperwood, which is a science delivery nonprofit in Sonoma County, EcoAdapt, a nonprofit who focuses on ecological restoration, and the Conservation Biology Institute, another science nonprofit, to really look at the question that I ask myself is, as a manager, knowing what's coming, what are the decisions I need to be making now in the context of climate change? How should I be prioritizing my resources? Which projects should I be picking up first? And the goal of this project is to really start to put some flesh on that question. And so the first place we're starting is, what are our projections? Downscaling from these global circulation models to our region here, what do we expect to see in a future world? And so I'll talk through this figure in just a second, but I'll just first say is that we're taking this project on at the scale of the Golden Gate biosphere rather than at the scale of our park boundaries, because it's the kind of problem that doesn't make sense to look at a jurisdictional scale. So instead we're looking at it at a multi-county scale, so Sonoma, Marin, San Francisco, and San Mateo. And so what this is an end of century projection of what we might see in terms of temperature change in the Bay Area. This is a pessimistic emissions scenario, so hopefully, political will make the actual future not so dire as this, but projected changes in temperature of up to 3 degrees Celsius averaged across this region. And I don't know if I have a pointer here. Do I have a pointer, Patrick?
Yes. Yeah, the very top.
Oh, there we go. Okay. It's super variable across the area. So you can see some parts of the coast, like Point Reyes especially, are going to see much more increase in temperature, and some other places are buffered, like the Sonoma Mountains and the Santa Cruz Mountains here. And then similar projection for precipitation. The models for precipitation in our area are much more mixed than the temperature models. Some project increased drought, others project increased precipitation. Here we see a slight increase in precipitation by end of century, but again, really variable. So you can see wetter in the Sonoma Mountains with increased drought down in San Mateo County. And then as a coastal park, it's also really critical for us to think about what sea level rise is how sea level rise is gonna impact us. And so we have actually the oldest tidal gauge on the West Coast in our park near Crissy Field. It's been continuously operating since 1854, and this is a figure actually put together by Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. And you can see over the time period of this figure from 1854 to 2016, there were already 9 inches of sea level rise. And then projecting out to 2100, it could be anywhere from 1.5 feet to 4 feet, or even in some of the more dramatic scenarios, up to 6 feet of sea level rise. So knowing what this future we're looking at might hold, the next question we're asking ourselves is, what are our potentially most vulnerable ecosystems? And we're looking at that question from a few different angles. And the first of those is a qualitative review of some of our key ecosystems and species. So looking through the scientific literature and really trying to tease out which of our systems and species are most vulnerable. So one that rises to the top is estuarine wetlands. Coastal dunes, for reasons that are obvious, I think, are potentially very vulnerable. Redwood forests. On the species side, coho salmon, we're already seeing really dramatic declines in coho. This past winter was the first time since we've been monitoring that we didn't see coho spawn in Muir Woods. So that was a really sad event. Mission blue butterfly, which I already mentioned, an endangered butterfly. And another endangered butterfly species, this is the San Bruno elfin. This is its caterpillar there, very charismatic caterpillar. So those are, and this is a really helpful information for me as a manager, right? Because I can start to then prioritize where the work that we're going to be doing is focused and which species to really focus on. Another angle on the same question, this may look familiar to David. This is from some work that came out of his lab in 2015, modeling vegetation communities and how they might shift in a future climate and looking at who some of the winners and the losers might be. So the squares here are different climate scenarios, and the warm colors indicate, moderate or major decline in extent. So we can expect a future where our oak species are struggling. And then the turquoise color here are species that might benefit in future climates. So we're expecting an expansion of our shrub system. So coastal scrub or chamise chaparral are species that we might expect to do better in a future climate. And then the last sort of angle I'll talk about on the same question of, what are the vulnerabilities and who do we think the winners and losers will be in a future climate is species distribution modeling. So what you're seeing here is California black oak and what the climate envelope for this species is in the present day. So what's its temperature tolerance? What's its precipitation tolerance? And based on that, where do you expect to see it on the landscape? And then you project that forward to end of century, and you can see we're probably going to lose a lot of habitat for California black oak. And this is really exciting because it's spatially explicit, and we can start to tease out. Of course, these are models. This is not the truth of the future, but we can start to tease out where we might take no regrets action, to increase the resilience of our oak forests or whatever the choices might be. So shifting gears a little bit, I also wanted to talk about sea level rise. In addition to managing wild places, national parks also manage a lot of infrastructure and visitor facilities. This is a picture of Stinson Beach in Marin County, and you can see our bathroom here is very close to where we're already seeing coastal erosion. And this place is really the tip of the spear for us in terms of sea level rise and potential impacts on park infrastructure. This is Stinson Beach before it was developed. It was actually a really incredible place. So Escoot Creek drains the west side of Mount Tam, and it terminated in this poison pond here, which was surrounded by this willow, riparian, and dune habitat. In the 1950s, when it was managed by state parks, not the National Park Service, Poison Pond was paved over and turned into a parking lot. And now it's an extremely popular visitor destination and, frankly, a climate refuge for interior places that are really hot on a summer day. There's still some amazing dune and riparian forests on this place, but it's a really heavily used visitor site. It's also very, very prone to flooding because of the proximity to the coast and because of those drainages coming off of Mount Tam. This place floods a lot. Since I've worked at the Golden Gate National Parks, I started there in 2012, I've seen major floods damaging infrastructure in 2012, 2014, 2018, and 2023. These are some pictures from the 2018 flood, and you can see it's really dramatic damage to our parking lots. Okay, so where does science fit in here? Ultimately, these are difficult management value judgments, management decisions, but science is really critical in telling us, what we need to know to be able to make these decisions. So we've done vulnerability assessment of our infrastructure there to tell us, which parts of the site are most vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding from Escoot Creek. We can also just use it as a visualization tool. So this is a pessimistic end of century scenario of what coastal storm surge might look like in a big storm event. You can see basically the whole site is inundated. And so these are the tough choices we have to make. How do you balance, parking in a place that's very, very busy with, bringing the parking lots back, making space for dune retreat. We know that dunes are a vulnerable ecosystem. This is our lifeguard tower here. You can see also very close to where the coastal erosion is happening. And how do you balance the need for visitor safety and whether or not you would invest in rebuilding this site, knowing how close to the coast it is. Really tough decisions, but having the information, making those is critical. Okay, so now I'm gonna do a big shift in gears. I'm gonna move us up to the Sierra Nevada. Instead of, a maps and statistics-based introduction to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park, I'm just gonna play this really quick 1-minute video to kind of set the stage of what this place is like. This is a really special place. If you haven't gone, you should absolutely go. As you might imagine, Sequoia National Park was established to protect giant sequoias. These are an incredible tree. They are, lived up to thousands of years. They're the largest tree by mass and volume on the planet. There are only 78 giant sequoia groves on the planet. Most of them are in and around Sequoia National Park in the southern Sierra Nevada. There are a few groves in Yosemite. Calaveras Big Trees is up here north of Yosemite, but the vast majority of the range of this species is right in and around Sequoia National Park in the southern Sierra. This species is very fire adapted. The cones actually require fire in order to be able to open and release seed. It has really thick bark. It can tolerate even moderately severe fire as long as it retains at least 10% of its canopy as green in a fire, it can survive. These forests evolve with fire for many centuries and thousands of years. Under Native American management and lightning fire, they would have burned every, say, 10 to 15 years. However, what's happening in the southern Sierra Nevada right now is unlike anything that these forests have seen before. The 2012 to 2016 drought killed hundreds of millions of trees in the southern Sierra Nevada, mostly not giant sequoias. There were some giant sequoias killed from the drought, but vast majority not. Pine trees, other trees in the mixed conifer. And so what's happened is with all of those dead trees, a century of fire suppression, and then a warmer climate, these forests are burning in ways that they've never burned before. Fires that are huge, that are really much more intense than they ever would have been. And it's having a devastating effect on giant sequoia forests. Folks may remember the 2020 and 2021 fire seasons were especially bad in California, and they were especially bad for giant sequoias. I'm good. The 2020 Castle Fire, which burned mostly in Sequoia National Forest, just south of Sequoia National Park, burned through 22 giant sequoia groves and it killed between 7,500 and 10,500 monarch giant sequoia trees. I'm not talking about trees of any size. I'm talking about trees that are 4 feet in diameter or bigger. That's somewhere between 10 and 14% of all the giant sequoias in the world. One fire. Then in 2021, there were 2 additional fires in the giant sequoia range, the KNP fire, which burned mostly in Sequoia National Park, also in Sequoia National Forest and some of the surrounding areas, and the Windy fire, which was mostly in Sequoia National Forest. And that fire burned through an additional 27 giant sequoia groves and killed somewhere between 2,200 and 3,600 more monarch giant sequoia trees. So between those 3 fires in 2 years, which is right like the blink of an eye in the lifespan of a giant sequoia, somewhere between 13 and 19% of all the giant sequoia trees in the world were killed. And I once asked a wise person, David Ackerley, who's in this room, as a land manager, what should I be doing in the context of climate change? Like, this is really hard. What's your advice? And what he said really stuck with me, which was bearing witness. And science, I think, has a hugely important role to play in bearing witness, to be able to put numbers on these numbers of dead trees and to be able to tell the story of, what's happening, why it's happening, is critically important. I do want to end on a note of hope, though. The managers up at Sequoia Kings Canyon have done the climate modeling and determined that the places where the giant sequoia groves have burned hot will still support giant sequoia forests in future climates. And so they're working on projects to revegetate, to replant giant sequoias in places that burn too hot, to revegetate naturally, and to increase the pace and scale of prescribed burning in the remaining giant sequoia groves so that they can survive the fires that are going to burn through in the future. And I think generally speaking, on this topic of land management in the context of climate change, which can be really heavy, what gives me hope is restoration. We know how to heal these places. There's a quote from E.O. Wilson that I wanted to end with. There can be no purpose more inspiriting than to begin the age of restoration, reweaving the wondrous diversity of life that still surrounds us. So that's what brings me hope. I alluded to a personal connection at the beginning of this, and so that's where I'll end. One of the hats I wear besides my ranger hat is I'm a mom. I have 2 kids, and this is my son. He's 7 years old. We're at Tenaya Lake this past summer, and his name is Starker. And we named him Starker after A. Starker Leopold because of the really important role that he played in science and conservation in the National Park Service and how critically important I feel that is. So I'm going to end there, and thank you.
Thank you. And we are going to take questions now. Thank you, Alison, for sharing those innovations with us and that note of hope with the... Yes. Thank you, Alison, for sharing those innovations from the national parks today and that note of hope with the next generation Starker. So we will take questions for about 10 or 15 minutes. And as I recall, somebody who registered included a question on the registration form. So we're going to start with that. And we have two microphones. And you have your portable microphones.
Thank you so much. Both talks really inspiring, and I learned a lot. Thank you very much for organizing this, Patrick. So I included a question when I RSVP'd. Mainly, I want to know how is scientific work sort of incorporated or separated from recreational services in the national parks? Thank you.
That's a good question. I would say that they're intertwined in that we really need to understand the impacts of recreation at times. And then they're also separate in that, at times it's a totally different discipline, whether it's, telling the stories of the park versus doing a restoration project. So we, of course, all sit really closely at the table together and are sharing our innovations. And then I think another key answer to that is that a really important role that parks play is in telling the stories of science to our visiting public. So our interpretive staff is our name for the recreational services folks, and we work really closely with them to get the information out about the science we're doing and the science-based work that we're doing in the park. So I guess from my biased perspective, that's maybe one of the most important places where those two worlds connect.
Jerry, George Wright at the beginning dealt with this key issue of the two aspects of the National Park Service mission of resource conservation and enjoyment by the public. So, perhaps you could share a little bit about that for this question from May.
Well, things were quite different back then, but the service was created in 1916 by cross-section of people, and Mather was the first, Stephen Mather was the first director, and then Horace Albright. They were both famous for enjoying putting on entertainment and shows in the parks for visitors, which is something that Wright and his colleagues tried to push back against, or at least find a better combination. So it was quite stark. They had the bear feeding, they had Let the Fire Fall in Yosemite. Superintendents wanted to put out salt licks right alongside the road so that the animals would come in and people wouldn't have to get out of their cars. And so the contrast to today was pretty stark. And that's one of the main things I think that they began to do was to change the perspective of what was important to manage inside the national parks and to try to make it a little more natural. I mean, it took a long time. It's still being done, but at least the voice was present at that time. Yeah.
Great. Another question? Annie, who's actually the executive director of Together. No, I just wanted to recognize your work, Together Bay Area, landscape scale conservation in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Thank you for that. I might not have raised my hand if I knew that was coming. I'm curious to hear from both of you from the different time periods, how you work actually in the landscape scale, or how George Wright talked about or wrote about or thought about what was happening outside of the park boundary. And then to you, Alison, what you're doing as part of the Biosphere Network, but also as part of One TAM or some of the other work kind of outside, knowing that things don't stop at the border. And thank you both so much for this.
So, as I mentioned briefly, that was one of the main things that Wright really did not appreciate or like was the strict borders of the national parks at the time, just because it didn't reflect faunal reality, basically. But of course, they were created at a time when they were just trying to preserve, in many cases, just a single amazing geologic feature, right? So, and most of those parks were also surrounded at the time by Forest Service. Remember, he was a trained forester, so he kind of spoke their language, even though the Forest Service and the National Park Service were constantly butting heads. And so he had a landscape scale perspective of what should be done, but it was he was coming up against cultural and administrative issues that were really, really hard to break. But what he was trying to do also, at the time, there was only 20 national parks when he was working. And so he was trying to argue that in the future, that those faunal landscape scale issues should be incorporated into the creation of new parks, which is why he was so excited about Waterton Glacier International Peace Park in Canada and the United States, because it was gigantic, even though Glacier has some really straight lines, and why he was very excited about Big Bend and that potential international park, which is like amazing to think about today with our situation. But it's also why he was very interested and very involved in Everglades, because he saw that as a chance to do something big. And literally, those were his terms. And so he started that thinking, and I think that eventually it evolved over time. And during the presentation I was giving today to the Hispanic Resources Group, there was a woman who's a GIS specialist, and she was just amazed that he was thinking about borders. back in the 30s. So.
Yeah, following on to that, one of the key things I didn't mention from the Revisiting Leopold report was just that, encouraging managers to think across boundaries. And there's amazing stuff going on across the service around this. You know, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative is one, and I'm sure I don't even know the half of it from where I sit in my, local Bay Area park. But what I can say about what we're doing locally, and you know this as well as I do, Annie, we have a lot of amazing collaborative work through Together Bay Area, through the One Tam initiative, which is looking at One Tam as a whole mountain, not separating out state parks from national parks, from county parks, and being able to do, whether it's invasive plant management or looking at our wildlife populations across the scale of the mountain landscape and not in our individual jurisdictions. And then scaling out even bigger the Golden Gate Biosphere, which is, 4 counties from Sonoma to San Mateo, and including our oceans. Again, just allowing us to solve these problems at the scale they're occurring and to not duplicate efforts. And then, it also is amazing to have a network of colleagues at our partner agencies that we might not work with otherwise. It's a huge lift.
Great. Another question? Jerry Thomas.
Hi. Oh, okay. I'm aware that the Park Service generally in the past has had a lot of restrictions on human activities in wilderness. And I love your idea, Alison, of some of your hope is restoration. And I'm wondering if the attitude is changing about restoration in wilderness or how the Park Service is figuring that out.
Yeah, Terry, that's a great question. And I think the Sequoia Kings Canyon giant sequoia work is a really good example of that, because a lot of that is happening in wilderness. And the park is being really careful and rigorous in their environmental review to make that possible. And I guess I would say that I do think the attitude is changing, in that, we know that we can't just step away and do nothing. These places, because of climate change, are not going to heal themselves.
Great. You talk with them a lot. Let's get somebody from the general.
The director?
Yes, in back.
I'll shout.
No, why don't you?
I can also.
Sorry, John.
On our way.
Thank you for the very insightful and engaging talk. I'm Megan. I realize I don't have a name tag. So in our first talk, Jerry, we saw a little bit, and we saw kind of a wonderful, memorable photograph from a conversation that Wright had with an Indigenous elder. And then you brought up later, Alison, some discussion of how we're trying to incorporate more Indigenous knowledge and incorporating more prescribed burns into our management practices at the NPS. And so there's kind of a thread that we can see of incorporating more Indigenous knowledge and more Indigenous land stewardship. And that's something that I've experienced in kind of working in ecological land management, or with ecological land management. And so I'm curious, Alison and Jerry, also from your perspective, what you're seeing as kind of the concrete next steps in bringing in more Indigenous land stewardship and more Indigenous land management, and what your hopes are in that direction.
I can go first and then pass it to you, Jerry. I think it's actually a really exciting time right now in the Park Service for tribal engagement and Indigenous stewardship. We've, for the first time in history, a Native American Park Service director and Secretary of the Interior, which is incredible. And there's an emphasis on this that I haven't seen before in my 20 years in the service. And in terms of concrete next steps, the thing that I'm seeing is co-stewardship agreements between tribes and parks. Point Reyes has one already signed. At Golden Gate, we're working on one, and this is happening, across the service to really bring tribes to the table in a more meaningful way than has happened before, and really sit down and make management decisions together. So that's really exciting.
Excuse me. The George Wright Society is actually working on some of these issues, and they have a very diverse board, including some really dynamic indigenous people, and they are convening meetings and working on that issue. And there's a lot of exciting possibilities moving forward, co-management. And during Wright's time, unfortunately, it was still a fairly racist society, you can imagine. But you know, Ben Thompson said it was amazing what George Wright was able to do because he was so young and he was up against older Caucasian males most of the time in an entrenched culture. And he reminded me, he said, you know, he was able to do all these things because of his intellect and his the research he had done. And then he reminded me that he was only 5'4" and he had dark skin. And Ben Thompson said he was able to overcome that also. Now, I didn't come across any incidents of racism with Wright himself, but the one time Wright got involved with some Native American issues was in Glacier, because he was trying to convince the director, you know, if you look at the east side of Glacier, I mean, it wobbles a little bit, but basically it's a straight line, just like those lines he hated. And, you know, former Blackfeet land, right? And then the Blackfeet Reservation was to the east. And he was with Dixon when a trail crew uncovered a bison skull way high up in Glacier. And they knew by reading the literature that bison had been there, but to him, it really struck him that it had to be reintroduced. And what he writes in Fauna 1 and 2 is a very heartfelt reasoning behind it, was that it's important to the Blackfeet and for their culture and their survival for them to have bison. They didn't have any. And for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the Blackfeet were not interested in working with the Park Service at that time, for obvious reasons, they weren't introduced then. They weren't actually introduced onto the reservation until fairly recently. And now it's a very active program of management.
Yes, I'd like to add to that indigenous co-management of public lands is an emerging area of both scientific research and practice on the ground. And I'm really grateful for the work of John Jarvis. People have alluded to him. John served as 18th director of the U.S. National Park Service, and he's now chair of the board of advisors of the Institute. And he got the funding to organize a workshop on this topic. Next year, we'll be convening indigenous natural resource managers and state, local, and federal government managers together to share the positive lessons of indigenous co-stewardship of resources, resources that are rightfully theirs. And we have some case studies from the U.S. national parks and other public lands. So thanks for your question. Somebody else had a question here, and I didn't want to miss them. Okay, well, if not, I'll have one more question, and then I'll wrap up. And if you, anybody who has other questions, of course, are welcome to talk with Alison and Jerry on the deck afterwards. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for a wonderful program, two terrific speakers. I wanted to follow up on one of the closing remarks that, Alison, you made, which is that in this time of climate change, the option of not doing anything is not one of those options. We have to do something. And I'm very much come out of the school of active management. I came out of the forestry department. Starker was my professor. And but there's another side to that, with how that pendulum swings. Because I imagine on a day-to-day basis, you have tremendous pressure to act and to come up with prescriptions where the science, you don't have the science yet to understand what you need to do. Because things are changing very quickly. I'll mention something like in Marin County, where I live, and I was on the Parks Commission. They're planting southern species of oaks on the properties because they think it's going to help adapt for climate change. But we don't really know how to adapt by just planting, Los Angeles oak in Novato. So I'm wondering how, on a day-to-day basis, you deal with that conflict between needing to work, but also as a scientist needing to do management-based science.
Yeah, assisted migration, as you're alluding to, that's a really tricky one. But my answer to your question is, I guess, twofold. I mean, one is what we're focusing on really is no regrets management choices. So things we can do that we know we're not going to regret them when they're not going to cause ecological harm and they're going to cause benefits. So, maybe that's bringing prescribed fire back. Maybe that's removing invasive species. Maybe that's restoring a creek system that's been damaged by humans in the past. And I will tell you that we have more of that type of work than we can do. So there's actually not pressure to be doing these novel things that we don't have the science for, just because we're really under-resourced in the critical work that we need to do that falls into that no regrets category.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Alison, for sharing your insights. Don't leave just yet. I wanted to also thank Catherine Baldwin, Cassie Darling of the College of Natural Resources, who handled all the organization. Thanks to you. And again, thanks to Estella Leopold, daughter of Aldo Leopold, whose generosity made this lecture series possible. Jerry spoke about the origins of science in national parks. Alison talked about science in national parks today. The UC Berkeley Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity is working on science in national parks for the future. We are a new institute at Berkeley, and we seek to bring science and solutions to halt climate change, conserve biodiversity, and improve the experience of nature for all. The heart of our work is by our faculty affiliates, and I see a number of them in the audience. Scott Stevens, who's 20 years of work in Yosemite, guides fire management in Yosemite. Our newest faculty affiliate, Justin Brechers, who conducts research on fence ecology in East Africa and other areas. Holly Doremus, who is a faculty co-director and conducts policy analyses on water and other environmental issues. Our new faculty co-director, Albert Ruhi, whose research in Pinnacles National Park is identifying refugia in intermittent streams under drought conditions. And Dacher Keltner, psychologist here at UC Berkeley and host of the Science of Happiness podcast, whose research on science-based well-being practices aims to make people more happy, but especially in connecting them with nature. So I hope I didn't miss any of them. Neil Tsutsui, who's actually worked a lot in the East Bay Regional Parks, bringing young people and a diversity of voices into the East Bay Regional Parks. Just about me, just a little, I really appreciated Alison's presentation, particularly because my individual research is on helping national parks, Yosemite, Sequoia, Kings, and Lassen Volcanic manage to reduce the catastrophic wildfire under climate change. So I do a lot of these analyses that Alison showed. Anyway, you might be wondering, you all love parks and national parks because you came here, and I really appreciate that. Alison has given us some hope for the future, and I just wanted to encourage all of you. She talked a lot about climate change and the threats of climate change to national parks, and you may be wondering, what can you do? So just as one small thing that you can do, for example, if all of the cars and light trucks in the United States were their own separate country, they would be the 8th biggest carbon polluter in the world. And that's the source of a lot of the problems occurring in national parks right now. So you can take action on climate change by walking, biking, taking public transit, living more sustainably. I live a car-free life, and I encourage all of you to also, so that together we can save our Earth for nature and people's well-being. Thank you.